Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment. Part 1. Hey guys, picture this. A respectable Victorian physician in his starched collar and waistcoat, leaning over a swooning woman on a velvet fainting couch. He's not prescribing laudanum or applying leeches. No, he's doing something that would make your grandmother blush and your great-great-grandmother, well, she might have been his patient. He's manually stimulating this woman to what we'd recognize as an orgasm, all while maintaining the clinical demeanor of someone treating a broken ankle. Welcome to the most absurd chapter in medical history, where female pleasure was literally prescribed as medicine, and nobody, absolutely nobody, seemed to realize what they were actually doing. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. The year is 1885, and Mrs. Whitmore sits in Dr. Henderson's consultation room, wringing her gloved hands as she describes her affliction. She suffers from what every respectable Victorian lady seems to suffer from: hysteria. Her symptoms: irritability, insomnia, anxiety, and what she delicately refers to as nervous episodes. The good doctor nods gravely, his pocket watch ticking in the gaslit silence. He knows exactly what ails her. Her womb is clearly wandering about her body like a lost tourist, causing all manner of distress. The cure? A therapeutic pelvic massage that will bring about what medical texts euphemistically call a hysterical paroxysm. If you're thinking this sounds suspiciously like medical malpractice dressed up in Victorian prudery, congratulations, you're about a century ahead of the medical establishment. But here's the truly mind-bending part. These doctors genuinely believed they were practicing legitimate medicine. They wrote scholarly papers about it. They taught it in medical schools. They complained to their colleagues about how exhausting the treatments were, apparently oblivious to the cosmic irony of their situation. Let me tell you about hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis that could explain everything from a woman's failure to smile at breakfast to her audacious desire to read books. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, because ancient physicians were convinced that women's reproductive organs were essentially tiny, angry creatures that wandered around their bodies causing mischief. Hippocrates himself promoted this theory, probably while his own wife rolled her eyes in the background. According to this wisdom, if a woman's uterus wasn't properly occupied with pregnancy, it would become restless and start touring her internal organs, pressing against her lungs, squeezing her heart, and generally causing what we'd now recognize as the symptoms of being an intelligent human trapped in a profoundly limiting society. By the Victorian era, this wandering womb theory had evolved into something even more ridiculous. Doctors now believed that women were fundamentally unstable creatures, their delicate constitutions constantly threatened by the overwhelming complexity of having both thoughts and feelings. A woman who expressed frustration with her lot in life? Hysteria. One who seemed melancholy after losing a child? Hysteria. A wife who wasn't sufficiently enthusiastic about her husband's romantic advances? You guessed it. Hysteria. The symptoms of hysteria were so conveniently broad that virtually any woman could be diagnosed with it. Nervousness, fatigue, irritability, loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, excessive sleeping, crying, not crying enough, all hysteria. It was like WebMD, but with more corsets and a shocking lack of self-awareness. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a prominent neurologist of the era, described hysterical women as having weak moral natures and being prone to emotional instability. One can only imagine his bedside manner. Madam, your problem is that you have feelings. Let me write you a prescription for having fewer of those. Tell me in the comments, can you imagine being diagnosed with hysteria for having a bad day? The sheer audacity of reducing women's complex emotional lives to a single, all-encompassing medical condition would be laughable if it weren't so tragically revealing of the era's attitudes toward women. The treatment for this invented ailment was where things got truly bizarre. Physicians discovered that they could alleviate a woman's hysterical symptoms by massaging her pelvic region until she experienced what they clinically termed a hysterical paroxysm: violent contractions, flushed skin, heavy breathing, and a profound sense of relief that left the patient calm and drowsy. Modern readers will immediately recognize this as an orgasm, but Victorian doctors were apparently struck with a collective case of willful blindness that lasted for decades. Dr. Rachel Maines, in her groundbreaking research on this topic, found that physicians of the era wrote extensively about these treatments without ever acknowledging their sexual nature. They described the paroxysm in purely mechanical terms: tension, release, restoration of balance. It was as if they'd discovered fire but insisted on calling it warm orange air. One physician wrote that the treatment was not unlike bleeding a patient to restore humoral balance, which is perhaps the most spectacular misunderstanding of human sexuality ever committed to medical literature. The procedure itself was exhaustingly labor-intensive. A typical session could last over an hour, with the physician manually stimulating the patient's genitals with oils, often lavender or rose, until she reached climax. Multiple sessions per week were common, and some women required daily treatments. Imagine Dr. Henderson returning home to his wife after a long day of giving orgasms to half the women in London, complaining about his sore wrists while she tried to keep a straight face. The medical journals of the time are filled with physicians lamenting the physical demands of hysteria treatment. Dr. George Taylor wrote in 1869 that the medical management of hysteria necessitates fatiguing treatments that often leave the practitioner more exhausted than the patient. Another doctor complained that the production of the hysterical paroxysm requires such persistent manipulation that it strains the physician's hand and wrist beyond comfortable endurance. These men were literally complaining about the difficulty of giving women orgasms while maintaining that what they were doing had nothing to do with sex. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. What makes this even more surreal is the matter-of-fact way these treatments were discussed in polite society. Husbands would send their wives for regular hysteria treatments the way we might send someone for physical therapy. Mothers would recommend good hysteria doctors to their daughters. Society ladies would gather for tea and casually mention their afternoon medical appointments, probably with knowing glances they weren't quite ready to acknowledge. The women themselves existed in a strange liminal space between patient and participant. Many undoubtedly understood on some level what was happening to them. Victorian women weren't stupid. They were just living in a society that had convinced itself that female sexuality didn't exist. Letters and diaries from the period hint at women's awareness of the true nature of their treatments. One woman wrote to her sister in 1889, "My visits to Dr. Morrison continue to provide remarkable relief for my nervous condition. I find myself quite looking forward to Thursday afternoons. The subtext is practically screaming from the page, but others may have genuinely accepted the medical explanation, having been so thoroughly convinced of their own sexual non-existence that they couldn't recognize their own pleasure." Imagine the psychological contortions required to experience an orgasm while believing you're receiving treatment for a disease. It's a testament to both human adaptability and the power of social conditioning. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think the women knew what was really happening, or were they as deluded as their doctors? The truly maddening aspect of this historical episode is how it reveals the Victorian talent for creating elaborate systems of denial. This was a society that covered piano legs to avoid impropriety, that referred to chicken breasts as white meat to avoid mentioning anything remotely anatomical, that required women to enter the ocean in wheeled bathing machines to preserve their modesty. Yet these same paragons of propriety saw nothing untoward in doctors spending hours manually stimulating women's genitals as long as it was labelled medicine. The hysteria diagnosis also served a sinister social function. It pathologized women's dissatisfaction with their constrained lives. A woman who chafed against the limitations placed on her, who yearned for education or independence or simply recognition as a complete human being, could be diagnosed as ill and subjected to treatments designed to make her more compliant. The hysterical paroxysm, ironically, may have been the only moment of genuine personal autonomy many Victorian women experienced, even if that autonomy was disguised as medical passivity. Dr. Brown-Séquard, a prominent French physician, wrote that hysteria was most common among women of the educated classes who have been taught to think beyond their natural capacities. The implication was clear. Women who wanted more than domesticity were literally diseased. The treatment, which left patients calm and compliant, effectively drugged them with their own endorphins back into social conformity. As we'll explore in the next part of our journey into this medical madness, the sheer volume of hysteria cases eventually created a problem that would lead to one of history's most unintentionally hilarious inventions. When you're manually treating dozens of hysterical women per day, your hands start to cramp. And when your hands start to cramp, you start looking for mechanical solutions. The result was the birth of the vibrator, not in some seedy back alley shop, but in the most respectable medical offices in the world, designed by doctors who continued to insist they had no idea what they were really doing. The legacy of hysteria treatment extends far beyond its obvious absurdity. It represents a perfect storm of medical ignorance, sexual repression, and social control that created a system where women's natural desires were pathologized, commodified, and controlled by male medical authorities. These women couldn't simply acknowledge their sexuality. They had to purchase it by the hour, disguised as healthcare, from men who profited from their ignorance while maintaining their own. Comment below if you've ever wondered how societies can maintain such elaborate systems of self-deception. The Victorian hysteria phenomenon shows us that humans are capable of the most extraordinary mental gymnastics when reality conflicts with their moral framework. In our next installment, we'll explore how this medical circus led to the invention of the world's first electrical appliances, how the demand for hysteria treatment created an entire industry, and how the eventual recognition of what was really happening led to one of history's most embarrassing professional about-faces. Trust me, it only gets more ridiculous from here. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment. Part 2. Picture Doctor. Joseph Mortimer Granville in his London clinic, circa 1883, flexing his aching fingers after yet another marathon session of what he'd euphemistically call therapeutic manipulation. His wrists are cramping, his hands are sore, and he's got 6 more. Hysteria patients scheduled before tea time. As he rubs circulation back into his fingers, he's struck by what he considers a brilliant medical insight. There has to be a more efficient way to induce hysterical paroxysms. Little does he know, he's about to accidentally invent what will become one of the world's most ubiquitous appliances, and he'll remain blissfully unaware of its true purpose right up until his dying day. The practical problem facing Victorian physicians was simple mathematics. If each hysteria treatment took an hour or more and demand was skyrocketing, doctors were spending their entire days manually stimulating patients. Medical journals from the period are filled with complaints that read like the world's most awkward workplace grievances. Dr. Franklin Martin wrote in 1882, "The monotonous regularity required for the mechanical production of the hysteric crisis strains the practitioner's endurance and frequently results in fatigue-related disorders of the hand and forearm. Imagine putting that on your insurance claim, occupational injury sustained while administering orgasms to treat made-up disease." The demand for hysteria treatment had exploded across Europe and America. Estimates suggest that up to 3/4 of middle and upper-class women were diagnosed with hysteria at some point in their lives. Clinics specializing in women's nervous disorders were sprouting up like mushrooms after rain, and the most successful practitioners were booked solid for months in advance. Dr. Georges Apostoli in Paris was seeing over 40 hysteria patients per day by 1885, which means he was spending roughly 10 hours daily manually bringing women to climax while maintaining the clinical detachment of someone checking blood pressure. The sheer scale of this operation reveals just how profoundly Victorian society had pathologized normal human sexuality. Think about it. 3/4 of women supposedly suffering from a condition that required regular induced orgasms to treat. Either Victorian women were experiencing an epidemic of wandering wombs, or society had created the most elaborate excuse for sexual satisfaction in human history. Spoiler alert, it wasn't wandering wombs. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever encountered a situation where an entire profession seemed oblivious to the obvious? Because what happened next makes those situations look like minor oversights. Enter the brilliant solution: mechanization. If manual manipulation was causing doctors repetitive strain injuries, why not harness the power of the industrial age to solve the problem? The same ingenuity that was revolutionizing factories and transportation could surely be applied to medical treatment. This reasoning led to the development of devices that would make the entire hysteria treatment more efficient, more standardized, and infinitely more ridiculous. The first mechanical aids were hand-crank contraptions that looked like they belonged in a Victorian engineer's workshop rather than a medical office. These early devices resembled elaborate egg beaters or miniature steam engines, with brass fittings and intricate gear systems. Doctors would position the patient on the examination table, apply the appropriate oils, and begin cranking away like they were starting a Model T Ford. The absurdity of dignified physicians in their formal attire operating what were essentially hand-powered sex toys while discussing the weather cannot be overstated. But these manual devices still required significant physical effort. What doctors really needed was the power of electricity, that mysterious force that was beginning to illuminate city streets and power factory machinery. Dr. Granville's breakthrough came with the development of the first electromechanical vibrator in the 1880s. His device, called the Granville hammer, was about the size of a sewing machine and required wall-mounted batteries to operate. It could reduce treatment time from over an hour to under 10 minutes, allowing doctors to see more patients and reduce their occupational hazards. Here's where the story becomes even more surreal. Granville was adamant that his invention had nothing to do with treating hysteria. He marketed his device exclusively for male nervous disorders and muscle tension, spending considerable effort distancing his creation from its most obvious and lucrative application. It's like inventing the telescope and insisting it's only for looking at the neighbour's fence. Meanwhile, every hysteria specialist in London was quietly purchasing Granville hammers and discovering just how effective they were at inducing those mysterious hysterical paroxysms. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this fiction was spectacular. Granville would lecture about his device's effectiveness in treating male neurasthenia, while literally every other doctor was using it to give women orgasms. Medical journals praised his innovation for advancing neurological treatment, while carefully avoiding any mention of its gynecological applications. It was a masterpiece of professional denial that would make modern politicians weep with envy. Tell me in the comments, can you imagine inventing something revolutionary and then desperately trying to pretend it doesn't do what it obviously does? By the 1890s, vibrators had become standard equipment in respectable medical offices across the Western world. The technological advancement was remarkable. What started as crude hand-cranked devices evolved into sophisticated electrical appliances with variable speeds, interchangeable attachments, and ergonomic designs. Hamilton Beach began manufacturing them commercially, and medical supply catalogues featured elaborate illustrations of doctors' offices equipped with the latest vibratory apparatus. These weren't discrete devices hidden away in shame. They were substantial pieces of machinery that required dedicated space and professional operation. Picture a Victorian consulting room, leather-bound medical texts on mahogany shelves, anatomical charts on the walls, a dignified Persian rug, and in the corner, humming quietly, a brass contraption that looked like it could power a small factory but was actually being used to give women orgasms under medical supervision. The marketing materials for these devices reveal the extraordinary mental gymnastics required to maintain the fiction that this was legitimate medicine. Advertisements describe vibrators as capable of treating nervous exhaustion, feminine disorders, and circulatory deficiencies, without ever explicitly mentioning sexual stimulation. One 1890s catalogue described a vibrator as providing rapid and thoroughly satisfactory treatment of various forms of nervous and muscular exhaustion. The euphemisms were so transparent they bordered on parody, yet everyone involved maintained their carefully constructed ignorance. The efficiency gains were remarkable and immediately apparent. Where Dr. Henderson might previously have treated 6 hysteria patients per day with manual methods, he could now see 20 or more using his new electrical equipment. The economic implications were staggering. Hysteria treatment became one of the most profitable medical specialties virtually overnight. Doctors who specialized in women's nervous disorders were driving the finest carriages and living in the most fashionable neighborhoods, all while insisting they were simply treating a mysterious feminine ailment with the latest scientific methods. The patient experience was equally transformed. Instead of lengthy, exhausting manual sessions, women now received quick, efficient treatments that could be scheduled as easily as any other medical appointment. The mechanical precision of the devices also standardized the treatment. No more variation based on the doctor's technique or stamina. Every patient received the same consistent, thorough medical intervention. The irony of industrializing female orgasms while denying their sexual nature represents perhaps the pinnacle of Victorian hypocrisy. But here's where the story takes an even more surreal turn. The vibrator became so successful as a medical device that entrepreneurs began marketing smaller, portable versions for home use. By 1900, you could order a vibrator through the Sears catalogue, alongside sewing machines and kitchen appliances. Think about that for a moment. The same catalogue that sold farming equipment and children's toys was also hawking devices specifically designed to provide women with sexual satisfaction, all under the guise of treating medical conditions. These home vibrators were revolutionary in ways their manufacturers probably never intended. For the first time in history, women could purchase devices specifically designed to provide sexual pleasure without having to acknowledge that pleasure's existence. They could order these devices from respectable catalogues, use them in the privacy of their own homes, and maintain the fiction that they were treating medical conditions rather than experiencing sexual satisfaction. The advertisements were masterpieces of euphemistic marketing. One 1906 had featured a demure Victorian lady holding a vibrator against her temple, with copy that read, "Every home should have this scientific marvel for the treatment of feminine nervous disorders." Another promised that regular use would result in improved circulation, enhanced vitality, and restored feminine equilibrium. The subtext was so obvious it might as well have been written in neon lights, yet everyone pretended to take it at face value. What's your take? Drop a comment about how an entire society managed to maintain such an elaborate system of collective denial about something so obvious. This domestic revolution happened with remarkably little scandal or social upheaval, largely because everyone involved maintained the elaborate pretense that vibrators were medical equipment. Husbands purchased them for their wives as health aids. Mothers recommended them to their daughters for treating nervous complaints. Society continued to function as if nothing had changed, even as thousands of women were quietly discovering sexual autonomy in their bedrooms, disguised as healthcare. The technological evolution during this period was rapid and impressive. Competition between manufacturers drove innovation at a pace that wouldn't be seen again until the personal computer revolution. Engineers developed quieter motors, more ergonomic designs, and increased portability. By 1910, vibrators were among the most technologically advanced small appliances available to consumers, incorporating features that wouldn't appear in other home devices for decades. The medical profession's response to this commercialization was typically obtuse. Rather than questioning why there was such massive demand for devices that supposedly treated a medical condition, doctors simply celebrated the efficiency gains and increased accessibility of treatment. Medical journals praised the democratization of hysteria therapy, apparently without irony. Dr. Samuel Spencer Wallian wrote in 1905, "The availability of domestic vibratory apparatus ensures that no woman need suffer from the distressing symptoms of hysteria simply due to geographical or economic constraints." The vibrator had become the iPhone of the Victorian era, a revolutionary technology that everyone owned but nobody quite understood. Unlike the iPhone, however, vibrators were solving a very real problem that society refused to acknowledge: the systematic denial of female sexuality. Women were finally gaining access to sexual satisfaction, but only by pretending they were treating a disease that didn't exist, with devices that their inventors claimed weren't designed for sexual purposes. As we'll discover in our next installment, this golden age of medical vibrators was about to face its greatest challenge. The very success of these devices was making it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that they had nothing to do with sex. Cultural changes were brewing that would eventually force society to confront the obvious truth about what had been happening in doctors' offices and Victorian bedrooms for decades. When that reckoning finally arrived, it would leave an entire medical specialty scrambling to explain what they'd been doing, and the vibrator would be exiled from respectable medicine into the shadows, only to emerge decades later as a symbol of sexual liberation. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment. Part 3. The year is 1920, and something is stirring in the cultural shadows that will shatter the elaborate fantasy Victorian medicine has constructed around female sexuality. Dr. Edmund Richardson sits in his London office staring at the latest medical journals with growing unease. Articles are appearing that question the very foundations of hysteria treatment. Worse yet, those newfangled moving pictures are showing women using vibrating devices in ways that look suspiciously recreational. For the first time in decades, the medical establishment is being forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What exactly have they been doing to their patients all these years? The beginning of the end for medical hysteria treatment came from an unexpected source: the emergence of psychoanalysis and the revolutionary work of Sigmund Freud. Now, before you start thinking Freud was some kind of feminist hero, let me stop you right there. His theories about women were often as problematic as anything the hysteria doctors believed. But Freud did accomplish something crucial. He suggested that hysteria might be psychological rather than physical, and more importantly, He acknowledged that women actually had sexual desires. This was earth-shattering for a medical establishment that had built an entire industry on the premise that women were essentially sexless creatures whose reproductive organs occasionally malfunctioned. Freud's ideas about repressed sexuality and psychological trauma offered alternative explanations for the symptoms that had been attributed to wandering wombs and uterine congestion. Suddenly, the neat little world where doctors could induce orgasms while maintaining they were treating a physical ailment was looking decidedly shaky. The psychoanalytic movement gained momentum throughout the 1910s and 1920s, and with it came increasingly uncomfortable questions about traditional hysteria treatment. If women's distress was psychological rather than physical, what did that say about decades of pelvic massage therapy? If female sexuality was a real and natural phenomenon rather than a medical impossibility, then what had all those therapeutic paroxysms actually been? Drop a comment and tell me. Can you imagine the moment when these doctors realized they'd been giving women orgasms for medical reasons, while insisting women didn't have sexual feelings? The cognitive dissonance must have been spectacular, but the real death blow to medical vibrator treatment came from an entirely unexpected direction: the movies. The 1920s saw the emergence of stag films, early pornographic movies that were shown in private clubs and gentlemen's establishments. These films often featured women using vibrating devices, and suddenly the medical fiction became impossible to maintain. When you could watch a woman obviously experiencing sexual pleasure from a device identical to the ones being sold in medical catalogues, the pretense that these were purely therapeutic instruments became laughably transparent. The vibrator's association with pornography created a scandal that reverberated through respectable society. Overnight, devices that had been proudly displayed in medical offices and advertised in family magazines became objects of shame and embarrassment. The Sears catalogue quietly discontinued vibrator sales in 1925, and medical supply companies began distancing themselves from devices they had previously promoted as revolutionary therapeutic tools. This represents one of the most spectacular professional about-faces in medical history. Doctors who had spent decades writing, learned papers about the therapeutic benefits of mechanical stimulation, suddenly found themselves pretending they'd never heard of such treatments. Medical schools that had taught courses on hysteria management quietly removed the subject from their curricula. Professional societies that had awarded prizes for innovations in vibratory therapy suddenly developed collective amnesia about the entire field. The speed with which the medical establishment abandoned hysteria treatment reveals just how tenuous the intellectual foundations had always been. If these treatments had been based on genuine medical understanding, the profession might have defended them or attempted to refine the theoretical framework. Instead, they vanished almost overnight, like a magician's trick performed in reverse. Now you see it, now you never heard of it. But what happened to all those women who had been receiving regular hysteria treatments? Were they suddenly cured of their mysterious ailment? Did the wandering wombs finally find their way home? The answer reveals the most damning aspect of the entire hysteria phenomenon. The symptoms that had supposedly required decades of medical intervention simply disappeared along with the diagnosis. Women didn't start collapsing in the streets from untreated hysteria. They didn't flood emergency rooms with paroxysm deficiency disorders. They just continued living their lives. This disappearing act exposed hysteria for what it had always been. Not a medical condition, but a social construct designed to pathologize and control women's experiences. The symptoms attributed to hysteria, anxiety, irritability, depression, restlessness, didn't vanish because they were never caused by wandering wombs or uterine congestion. They were the natural responses of intelligent human beings trapped in constraining social circumstances, misdiagnosed as medical problems, rather than recognized as rational reactions to irrational limitations. What's your take on this? Leave a comment about how an entire medical condition can just disappear when it becomes socially inconvenient to maintain the fiction. The aftermath of this medical retreat was complex and revealing. Vibrators didn't disappear. They went underground. What had been respectable medical devices became contraband items, sold through discreet channels and hidden away in bedroom drawers. The technology that had been celebrated as a triumph of medical innovation was suddenly treated as evidence of moral corruption. This transformation says everything about the power of social shame to reshape reality. The same devices, performing the same function, used by the same women, became completely different objects, simply because society decided to acknowledge what they actually did. Nothing about the vibrators changed except the cultural willingness to maintain the fiction that they were medical equipment. For women, this transition represented both loss and liberation. They lost access to the medical legitimacy that had allowed them to purchase and use these devices without social stigma. But they also gained something potentially more valuable, the opportunity to claim their sexuality on their own terms, rather than as patients requiring treatment for a fictional disease. The medical profession's abandonment of hysteria treatment also forced a broader reckoning with the fundamental assumptions about female sexuality that had underlied Victorian medicine. If women weren't naturally passionless, if their distress wasn't caused by defective reproductive organs, if their needs weren't pathological, then what did that mean for everything else medical science claimed to know about women's bodies and minds? This question would take decades to fully explore, and the answers would challenge not just medical practice but the entire social order that had been built on the assumption of female sexual non-existence. The hysteria episode had inadvertently proven that women were sexual beings with natural desires and responses, a revelation that had implications far beyond the medical consulting room. The 1930s and 1940s saw continued efforts to bury the embarrassing history of hysteria treatment. Medical journals avoided mentioning the subject, and textbooks that had once featured detailed discussions of therapeutic manipulation were quietly revised to remove all references to such practices. The collective amnesia was so complete that by the 1950s, many young doctors had never heard of hysteria as a serious medical diagnosis. But this erasure came at a cost. By refusing to acknowledge or learn from their spectacular misunderstanding of female sexuality, the medical profession missed opportunities to develop more enlightened approaches to women's health. Instead of examining why they had been so profoundly wrong about something so fundamental, they simply pretended it had never happened and continued with many of the same underlying assumptions about women's bodies and experiences. Meanwhile, the vibrator began its long journey from medical device to underground pleasure tool to eventual mainstream acceptance. Divorced from its medical pretensions, it could finally be understood for what it had always been, a device designed to provide sexual satisfaction. This honesty, while socially uncomfortable, was ultimately more authentic than the elaborate medical fiction that had surrounded its use for decades. The women who had lived through this transition found themselves in a strange position. Those who had received hysteria treatments knew exactly what they had experienced, regardless of what their doctors had called it. They had discovered sexual satisfaction in medical offices, and then watched as society decided that this satisfaction was shameful rather than therapeutic. The psychological impact of this reversal, from medical legitimacy to moral transgression, must have been profound and confusing. Tell me in the comments, how do you think it felt to have your medical treatment suddenly reclassified as sexual deviance? The women who lived through this transition experienced one of the most dramatic shifts in social meaning in modern history. The hysteria episode also reveals the extraordinary power of medical authority to shape social reality. For decades, the diagnosis of hysteria had allowed doctors to control and define women's experiences in ways that served patriarchal interests, while maintaining the fiction of scientific objectivity. Women's dissatisfaction with their limited social roles was redefined as illness. Their natural sexual responses were classified as symptoms. Their agency was replaced with medical dependency. When this medical framework finally collapsed, it left behind important questions about the relationship between medicine and social control that remain relevant today. How do we distinguish between genuine medical conditions and the pathologization of normal human experiences? When does medical authority become a tool of social oppression? How can we recognize when our assumptions about bodies and minds are shaped more by cultural prejudice than scientific understanding? As we'll explore in our next chapter, the death of medical hysteria treatment didn't immediately lead to enlightened attitudes about female sexuality. Instead, it ushered in a period of sexual shame and repression that would last for decades, until the women's liberation movement of the 1960s finally began to reclaim the territory that Victorian medicine had inadvertently mapped out. The vibrator's journey from medical device to feminist icon was far from over. It was just beginning a new and equally fascinating chapter. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment, Part 4. The 1930s arrived with a peculiar silence hanging over the medical profession. Where once the pages of respected journals had buzzed with discussions of hysterical paroxysms and therapeutic manipulation, there was now nothing but carefully curated amnesia. Dr. Margaret Cleaves, one of the few female physicians who had actually written about hysteria treatment from a woman's perspective, found her earlier papers mysteriously absent from medical school libraries. It was as if an entire field of medicine had been retroactively erased from history, leaving behind only embarrassed shuffling and the occasional nervous cough when someone accidentally mentioned the old days. But here's the truly maddening part. While the medical establishment was desperately trying to forget its orgasm-prescribing past, women were left to navigate the aftermath of this spectacular professional retreat. The same doctors who had spent decades insisting that female pleasure was a medical necessity now acted as if female sexuality was either non-existent or pathological. The whiplash must have been extraordinary. Imagine being told for years that you needed regular therapeutic stimulation for your health, only to suddenly discover that such stimulation was evidence of moral corruption. This wasn't just a simple case of medical fashion changing. The abandonment of hysteria treatment represented a fundamental shift in how society chose to understand women's bodies and experiences. The Victorian medical establishment had accidentally stumbled onto the reality of female sexuality while maintaining elaborate theoretical frameworks that denied its existence. When those frameworks became impossible to sustain, rather than updating their understanding, they chose to retreat into even more restrictive attitudes about women's sexual nature. The period from 1920 to 1960 became what we might call the Great Sexual Recession for women. The vibrator, once proudly displayed in medical offices and advertised in family magazines, was driven underground. Women who had grown accustomed to regular medical treatments for their nervous conditions suddenly found themselves cut off from socially acceptable access to sexual satisfaction. The devices that had revolutionized their private lives became objects of shame, hidden away like contraband whiskey during Prohibition. This underground period reveals the resilience and resourcefulness of women faced with sexual repression. They developed networks for sharing information about where to acquire vibrators, how to maintain them, and how to use them safely. These informal systems of knowledge transfer operated entirely outside official medical or social channels, creating a shadow world where women's actual experiences were acknowledged and addressed. What strikes me most about this period is how it exposes the arbitrary nature of sexual shame. The exact same activities that had been medically prescribed and socially acceptable suddenly became evidence of deviance and moral failing. Nothing about the physical reality changed, only the social interpretation of that reality. It's a perfect example of how sexual norms are constructed and enforced through collective agreement to believe certain fictions about human nature. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a situation where the same behavior was completely reframed from positive to negative overnight? Because that's essentially what happened to an entire generation of women. The medical profession's handling of this transition was particularly craven. Rather than acknowledging their decades of misunderstanding and using it as an opportunity to develop more honest approaches to women's health, they simply pretended it had never happened. Medical textbooks were quietly revised to remove all references to hysteria treatment. Professors who had taught courses on therapeutic manipulation suddenly developed selective amnesia about their expertise. Professional societies that had awarded innovations in vibratory therapy acted as if the field had never existed. This erasure had serious consequences for medical education and practice. Young doctors entering the profession in the 1930s and 1940s had no awareness of the hysteria episode and therefore no opportunity to learn from its mistakes. The same underlying assumptions about women's bodies and sexuality that had led to the hysteria diagnosis remained largely unexamined. Instead of using this embarrassing chapter as a case study in how cultural biases can distort medical practice, the profession chose willful ignorance. Meanwhile, the women who had lived through the hysteria era found themselves in an impossible position. They possessed first-hand knowledge of their own sexual capacity and needs, gained through years of medical treatment, but were now living in a society that insisted such knowledge was shameful or non-existent. Many were married to men who had enthusiastically supported their wives' medical treatments, but were now expected to pretend that female sexual response was either minimal or entirely focused on reproduction. The psychological impact of this cultural shift must have been profound. Imagine discovering sexual satisfaction under medical supervision, perhaps for the first time in your life, and then being told that this satisfaction was actually evidence of moral corruption. The shame and confusion generated by this reversal affected not just individual women, but entire families and communities. The underground vibrator market that emerged during this period was fascinating in its own right. Entrepreneurs who had previously sold medical devices now operated through discrete channels, often marketing their products as health aids or massage devices, while avoiding any explicit mention of their intended use. The euphemistic language became even more elaborate than during the medical era, creating a coded vocabulary that allowed women to discuss and acquire these devices without directly acknowledging their sexual purpose. Tell me in the comments, can you imagine having to develop secret codes just to talk about something as natural as sexual satisfaction? The lengths society went to maintain its collective denial were truly spectacular. This period also saw the emergence of alternative medical theories that attempted to address women's health concerns without acknowledging sexuality. The rest cure became popular for treating women's nervous conditions, involving complete bed rest, isolation from stimulation, and often forced feeding. This treatment was the exact opposite of hysteria therapy. Instead of providing stimulation, it removed all sources of excitement or agency. The underlying message was clear. Women's problems stemmed from having too much stimulation rather than too little. The rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, was often as traumatic as it was ineffective. Women were confined to their beds for weeks or months, forbidden to read, write, or engage in any intellectual activity. They were cut off from friends and family, fed a diet designed to increase their body weight, and subjected to massage treatments that were explicitly non-sexual. It was as if the medical profession had decided that the solution to their previous error was to swing completely in the opposite direction. Charlotte Perkins. Gilman's famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was based on her own experience with the rest cure and captures the psychological horror of this treatment. Her protagonist's descent into madness reflects the very real consequences of medical approaches that pathologized women's intellectual and emotional needs. The story serves as a powerful indictment of medical treatments that ignored women's actual experiences in favor of theoretical frameworks based on cultural prejudices. The contrast between the hysteria treatments of the Victorian era and the rest cures of the early 20th century reveals the medical profession's fundamental confusion about women's nature. First, they had provided sexual stimulation while denying its sexual nature. Then they provided sensory deprivation while claiming it addressed the same underlying problems. Both approaches were based on the assumption that women's distress was medical rather than social, but they prescribed completely opposite interventions. The real tragedy of this period is how it wasted opportunities for genuine understanding. The hysteria episode had inadvertently generated a vast body of empirical evidence about female sexual response, gathered under controlled conditions by trained observers. This data could have formed the foundation for a more scientific approach to human sexuality, one based on observed reality rather than cultural assumptions. Instead, the profession chose to discard this information rather than confront its implications. The women who had participated in hysteria treatments possessed unique insights into their own sexual nature, insights that could have informed more enlightened approaches to marriage, reproduction, and general health. But the social shame surrounding the hysteria episode meant that this knowledge remained private and unexamined. Women were left to navigate their sexual lives with the personal understanding they had gained through medical treatment, but without any social framework for applying that understanding. This disconnect between private knowledge and public discourse created a generation of women who understood their own bodies, but couldn't discuss that understanding openly. They knew they were capable of sexual satisfaction, but lived in a society that insisted such satisfaction was either impossible or improper. The psychological strain of maintaining this double consciousness must have been exhausting. As we'll explore in our next chapter, this period of sexual repression and medical amnesia couldn't last forever. The social changes of the 1960s would eventually force a reckoning with the legacy of the hysteria episode, leading to new understandings of female sexuality that acknowledged rather than denied women's capacity for pleasure. But that revolution was still decades away, and the intervening years represent a dark period when society chose ignorance over knowledge and shame over understanding. What lessons can we draw from this period? Drop a comment about how denial and shame can actually make problems worse rather than solving them. The medical profession's retreat from hysteria treatment didn't eliminate women's sexual needs. It just made addressing those needs more difficult and dangerous. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment. Part 5. The 1950s brought a curious paradox to American society. On the surface, everything looked perfectly ordered. White picket fences, nuclear families, and women who supposedly found complete fulfillment in domestic bliss. But beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility, something was stirring. The same women who had been told that female sexuality was either non-existent or pathological were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why did they feel restless despite having everything society promised would make them happy? Why did the marriage manuals that described sex as a duty to be endured seem so disconnected from their actual experiences? And why, despite decades of medical insistence to the contrary, did they still seem to have those mysterious urges that Victorian doctors had once treated so diligently? Enter Alfred Kinsey, a mild-mannered entomologist who had spent years studying gall wasps before turning his scientific attention to human sexual behavior. Kinsey's research in the 1940s and 1950s would shatter the comfortable lies that American society had been telling itself about sexuality, particularly female sexuality. His interviews with thousands of women revealed that the Victorian doctors had been accidentally correct about one thing. Women were indeed sexual beings with complex desires and responses. The medical profession's retreat from this reality hadn't changed the underlying biology. It had just made women's experiences invisible and shameful. Kinsey's findings were revolutionary and deeply threatening to the established order. He discovered that women were capable of multiple orgasms, that they masturbated far more frequently than anyone had imagined, and that their sexual responses were often more complex and varied than men's. This data directly contradicted decades of medical and social orthodoxy that portrayed women as essentially passive and uninterested in sexual pleasure. The research suggested that the Victorian hysteria treatments, despite their absurd theoretical framework, had stumbled onto genuine physiological realities. The publication of Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953 created a cultural earthquake. Here was scientific evidence that women had been sexual beings all along, that their capacity for pleasure was not only real, but often exceeded that of men. The book became a bestseller, suggesting that women were desperate for honest information about their own sexuality. But it also generated fierce backlash from religious leaders, politicians and medical professionals who preferred the comforting fiction of female sexual passivity. Tell me in the comments, can you imagine the shock of discovering that everything your society had told you about women's nature was completely wrong? The implications went far beyond the bedroom into questions of social organization, marriage, and women's roles in society. Kinsey's research inadvertently vindicated some aspects of the discredited hysteria treatments while exposing their fundamental dishonesty. The Victorian doctors had been providing real sexual satisfaction to their patients, but they had done so within a framework of medical control that denied women agency over their own experiences. Kinsey's work suggested that women didn't need medical supervision to understand and express their sexuality. They just needed accurate information and social permission. But the road from scientific research to social change was long and rocky. The 1950s were characterized by an intensification of domestic ideology that portrayed women's highest calling as wives and mothers. The suburban housewife became the cultural ideal, and any deviation from this role was seen as evidence of psychological maladjustment. Women who expressed dissatisfaction with domestic life were often diagnosed with neuroses and treated with tranquilizers, a new form of medical control that replaced the old hysteria treatments. The irony was profound. Victorian doctors had treated women's dissatisfaction by providing sexual satisfaction while denying its sexual nature. Mid-20th century doctors treated similar dissatisfaction by providing pharmaceutical sedation while denying that there might be rational reasons for women's unhappiness. Both approaches avoided confronting the possibility that women's distress might be a reasonable response to social limitations rather than evidence of individual pathology. The widespread prescription of tranquilizers to housewives in the 1950s and early 1960s represents another chapter in the long history of medicalizing women's experiences. Mother's little helper, as the Rolling Stones would later call it, became the new cure for female discontent. Instead of orgasms, women were now prescribed Valium and Librium to help them accept their restricted lives without complaint. The medical profession had learned nothing from the hysteria episode about the dangers of pathologizing normal human responses to abnormal social conditions. Meanwhile, the vibrator remained in cultural exile, associated with pornography and deviance rather than legitimate pleasure or health. The devices that had once been proudly displayed in medical offices were now hidden away, available only through discreet mail-order companies that marketed them with elaborate euphemisms. The underground market flourished, suggesting that demand for these devices remained strong despite social disapproval. The period between Kinsey's research and the sexual revolution of the 1960s was marked by growing cognitive dissonance. Scientific evidence increasingly supported the reality of female sexuality, but social norms continued to deny or suppress it. Women found themselves caught between emerging knowledge about their capacity for pleasure and persistent cultural messages that such pleasure was inappropriate or dangerous. This tension created what we might call the happy housewife syndrome. Women who had all the external markers of success but felt profoundly unfulfilled. Betty Friedan would later call this the problem that has no name, but it might be more accurately described as the problem of having natural human needs that society refused to acknowledge. These women weren't sick. They were responding rationally to irrational circumstances. Drop a comment about whether you think it's possible to suppress natural human drives without creating psychological problems. The evidence from this period suggests that the attempt to deny female sexuality created more issues than it solved. The contrast between public discourse and private reality during this period was stark. Publicly, women were supposed to find complete fulfillment in domestic roles and minimal sexual expression. Privately, they were reading Kinsey's research, sharing information about sexual satisfaction, and quietly purchasing devices that provided the pleasure their society insisted they didn't need or want. The gap between official ideology and lived experience was becoming impossible to ignore. The medical profession's continued reluctance to address female sexuality honestly meant that women were left to figure things out on their own. They developed informal networks for sharing information about contraception, sexual techniques, and ways to achieve satisfaction within marriages that often provided little emotional or physical intimacy. These grassroots knowledge-sharing systems operated entirely outside official channels, creating a parallel world where women's actual experiences were acknowledged and validated. The pharmaceutical industry's response to women's discontent was telling. Instead of examining the social conditions that might be causing distress, companies developed drugs to help women better tolerate those conditions. The marketing for tranquilizers explicitly targeted housewives who felt overwhelmed, anxious, or depressed about their domestic responsibilities. The message was clear. The problem wasn't with women's circumstances, but with their inability to adapt to those circumstances. This medicalization of women's unhappiness served many of the same functions as the old hysteria diagnosis. It individualized problems that might have social causes, provided medical authority for controlling women's experiences, and offered profitable treatments that addressed symptoms while ignoring underlying issues. The specific treatments had changed, but the fundamental dynamic of medical control over women's emotional and physical lives remained remarkably consistent. The period also saw the emergence of marriage manuals and sex guides that attempted to provide women with information about sexuality while maintaining traditional power structures. These books often acknowledged women's capacity for sexual pleasure, but framed that pleasure primarily in terms of pleasing their husbands or fulfilling their reproductive duties. Female sexuality was recognized but domesticated, channeled into socially acceptable forms that supported rather than challenged existing arrangements. As the 1960s approached, the contradictions in American sexual culture were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Women had access to scientific information about their sexuality, growing economic independence, and expanding educational opportunities, but they were still expected to conform to domestic ideals that assumed female passivity and limited aspirations. The stage was set for a cultural revolution that would finally confront the legacy of the Victorian hysteria episode and begin the long process of integrating honest acknowledgement of female sexuality into social and medical practice. The transformation that was coming would be dramatic and controversial, involving everything from the development of the birth control pill to the emergence of the women's liberation movement. As we'll explore in our next chapter, the vibrator would play a symbolic role in this revolution, transitioning from medical device to underground contraband to feminist icon. But the journey from shame to liberation would be neither simple nor complete, and the echoes of the Victorian medical confusion about female sexuality would continue to reverberate through American culture for decades to come. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment, Part 6. The year is 1963, and Helen Gurley Brown has just published Sex and the Single Girl, a book that would have given Victorian doctors collective apoplexy. Brown wasn't just acknowledging female sexuality, she was celebrating it, encouraging women to pursue pleasure on their own terms, and suggesting that marriage wasn't the only path to fulfillment. Meanwhile, the birth control pill was becoming widely available, giving women unprecedented control over their reproductive choices. The cultural ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet, and the old Victorian assumptions about female nature were about to face their final reckoning. The sexual revolution of the 1960s represented everything the hysteria episode had accidentally stumbled toward, but never achieved. Honest acknowledgement of female sexuality, women's agency over their own bodies, and the rejection of medical authority as the sole gatekeeper of sexual knowledge. The revolution was messy, incomplete, and often contradictory, but it finally began the process of integrating the reality of female sexual capacity into mainstream culture. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published the same year as Brown's book, approached the problem from a different angle, but reached similar conclusions. Friedan identified what she called the problem that has no name, the profound dissatisfaction experienced by educated women who were told that domestic life should fulfill all their needs. Her analysis connected individual psychological distress to social structures in ways that the hysteria doctors had never imagined. Instead of treating women's unhappiness as a medical condition, Friedan suggested it might be a rational response to irrational limitations. This shift in perspective was revolutionary. For the first time since the collapse of hysteria treatment, mainstream voices were suggesting that women's distress might not require medical intervention, but social change. The problem wasn't with women's bodies or minds, it was with a society that refused to acknowledge their full humanity. This analysis directly challenged the medical model that had dominated thinking about women's issues for over a century. The women's liberation movement that emerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s took these insights even further. Feminist activists began organizing consciousness-raising groups where women could share their experiences without medical supervision or interpretation. These groups served some of the same functions as the old hysteria treatments. They provided relief from isolation, validation of women's experiences, and a sense of community. But they did so within a framework of empowerment rather than medical control. Tell me in the comments, can you imagine the liberation of finally being able to discuss your experiences honestly without having them immediately pathologized or dismissed? The consciousness-raising movement represented a fundamental shift from individual medical problems to collective social analysis. The vibrator's return to respectability was gradual and initially controversial. The device that had been driven underground by association with pornography began to emerge as a symbol of women's right to sexual autonomy. Feminist activists and sex educators started discussing vibrators openly, framing them not as medical devices or shameful secrets, but as tools for self-discovery and pleasure. This reframing was radical. It suggested that women could claim sexual satisfaction as a right, rather than accepting it as a medical prescription or hiding it as a guilty secret. The Masters and Johnson research of the 1960s provided scientific legitimacy for this cultural shift. William Masters and Virginia Johnson conducted systematic laboratory studies of human sexual response, documenting the physiological realities that Victorian doctors had observed but never understood. Their research confirmed that women were capable of multiple orgasms, that female sexual response was complex and varied, and that many women could achieve satisfaction more easily through clitoral stimulation than through vaginal penetration alone. This last finding was particularly significant because it suggested that the Victorian doctors' focus on external genital massage had been physiologically appropriate, even though their theoretical framework had been completely wrong. The irony was perfect. The hysteria treatments had accidentally stumbled onto effective techniques for female sexual satisfaction while maintaining elaborate theories that denied the sexual nature of what they were doing. Masters and Johnson's work also revealed the extent to which cultural assumptions had distorted understanding of sexuality. They found that many of the differences between male and female sexual response that had been assumed to be biological were actually the result of social conditioning and lack of information. Women who were given accurate information about their bodies and permission to explore their sexuality showed response patterns that contradicted decades of medical orthodoxy. The publication of Human Sexual Response in 1966 created another cultural earthquake, but this time the scientific establishment was more prepared to acknowledge the implications. The research provided objective, laboratory-based evidence for phenomena that had been denied, dismissed, or pathologized for generations. It became impossible to maintain that women were naturally passive or uninterested in sexual pleasure when there was scientific documentation of their capacity for intense and sustained sexual response. The feminist movement's approach to sexuality was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, activists celebrated women's right to sexual pleasure and autonomy. On the other hand, they were deeply critical of how sexuality had been used to control and objectify women. The vibrator became a symbol of this tension. It represented women's right to pleasure, but it also raised questions about the relationship between technology, intimacy, and human connection. Some feminists embraced vibrators as tools of liberation that allowed women to discover their own sexual responses without dependence on male partners or medical authorities. They organized workshops on sexual self-discovery, published guides to using sex toys safely, and argued that women's right to pleasure was a fundamental aspect of their liberation. This approach directly challenged the Victorian assumption that female sexuality existed primarily to serve male needs or reproductive purposes. Other feminists were more ambivalent about the role of technology in sexuality, worried that devices might replace human intimacy or reinforce unrealistic expectations about sexual performance. These concerns reflected broader questions about the relationship between personal liberation and social change. Could individual women achieve sexual freedom within a society that remained fundamentally patriarchal? Did focusing on personal pleasure distract from larger struggles for economic and political equality? Drop a comment about whether you think individual liberation and social change can happen simultaneously, or if one has to come before the other. The feminist movement struggled with these questions throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The commercialization of the sexual revolution created new complications. As vibrators became more socially acceptable, they also became big business. Companies that had previously marketed these devices through euphemisms and coded language now began advertising them more directly, but within a framework of consumption rather than liberation. The devices that had once been symbols of medical control and then feminist empowerment were becoming consumer products subject to market forces. This commercialization had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it made vibrators more widely available and reduced the shame associated with purchasing them. Women no longer had to navigate underground markets or decode euphemistic advertisements to access these devices. On the negative side, the marketing often reinforced problematic ideas about sexuality, suggesting that satisfaction could be purchased rather than developed through self-knowledge and communication. The medical profession's response to the sexual revolution was characteristically confused and self-serving. Some doctors embraced the new openness about sexuality and began incorporating honest discussions of sexual health into their practice. Others retreated into defensive positions, arguing that medical authority was still necessary to guide women's sexual development. The profession that had once prescribed orgasms while denying their sexual nature now struggled to find an appropriate role in a culture that was beginning to acknowledge sexuality openly. The period also saw the emergence of sex therapy as a legitimate medical specialty. Practitioners like Masters and Johnson began treating sexual dysfunction using techniques that acknowledged the reality of sexual desire and response in both men and women. This represented a dramatic shift from the Victorian era, when women's sexual issues had been treated through mechanical stimulation while denying the sexual nature of the treatment. Now, sexual problems were addressed through education, communication, and therapeutic intervention that acknowledged sexuality as a normal and healthy aspect of human experience. The transformation wasn't complete or unproblematic. Many doctors continued to approach women's sexuality with paternalistic attitudes, and the medical establishment remained reluctant to fully acknowledge the extent of its previous errors. The hysteria episode was rarely discussed in medical education, and few practitioners showed interest in examining how cultural biases had distorted their understanding of women's bodies and experiences. As we approach the final chapters of this strange historical journey, it's worth reflecting on how far society had travelled from the Victorian consulting rooms, where doctors prescribed orgasms while maintaining they were treating wandering wombs. The sexual revolution of the 1960s represented a partial fulfillment of the accidental promise of hysteria treatment, that women were sexual beings capable of pleasure and deserving of satisfaction. But the path from medical control to personal autonomy had been long, difficult, and incomplete, with many of the underlying issues about gender, power, and bodily autonomy still unresolved. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment, Part 7. The 1970s and 1980s brought a curious epilogue to our tale of medical absurdity. Dr. Rachel Maines, a technology historian at Cornell University, was researching the development of household appliances when she stumbled across something that made her do a double take. Buried in medical journals and patent applications from the Victorian era was evidence of what appeared to be the most spectacular case of professional self-deception in recorded history. Doctors had spent decades prescribing and administering orgasms to treat a non-existent disease, all while maintaining that what they were doing had nothing to do with sex. Mayne's research would eventually expose this forgotten chapter of medical history, forcing society to confront the bizarre legacy of its own sexual ignorance. By the time Maynes began her research in the 1980s, the hysteria episode had been so thoroughly erased from medical memory that many of her colleagues initially didn't believe her findings. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical journals filled with discussions of hysterical paroxysms, patent applications for vibratory devices, advertisements for therapeutic massage equipment, but the cognitive dissonance was so extreme that it seemed like elaborate historical fiction rather than documented fact. The rediscovery of the hysteria episode came at a time when society was still grappling with the changes initiated by the sexual revolution. Women had achieved greater sexual autonomy and social equality, but many of the underlying attitudes about female sexuality remained problematic. The medical profession had largely abandoned its paternalistic approach to women's sexual health, but it had never really examined how it had gone so spectacularly wrong for so many decades. Mayne's work revealed the hysteria episode as a perfect case study in how cultural assumptions can blind entire professions to obvious realities. The Victorian doctors weren't evil or uniquely ignorant. They were products of their time, trapped within intellectual frameworks that made it impossible to see what was happening right in front of them. Their story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing cultural beliefs with scientific facts. The feminist movement of the 1970s and 1980s embraced the hysteria story as validation of their critiques of medical authority and gender bias in healthcare. Here was concrete historical evidence that the medical profession had systematically misunderstood women's bodies and experiences, pathologizing normal responses and providing treatments based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. The episode demonstrated how medical authority could be used to control women's experiences while maintaining the fiction of scientific objectivity. Tell me in the comments, what do you think would have happened if even one Victorian doctor had been honest about what they were observing? How might history have been different if they'd acknowledged the sexual nature of their treatments? The vibrator's journey from medical device to feminist icon reached its culmination during this period. What had once been a tool of medical control became a symbol of women's right to sexual autonomy. Feminist sex educators organized workshops on pleasure and self-discovery, explicitly rejecting the medical model that had framed female sexuality as pathological or dangerous. The device that Victorian doctors had used to treat invented diseases was reclaimed as a tool for exploring real desires. This transformation wasn't without controversy. Conservative critics argued that the feminist embrace of vibrators represented a rejection of traditional family values and natural relationships. They worried that women who could achieve sexual satisfaction independently might become less invested in marriage and motherhood. These concerns echoed Victorian anxieties about women's sexual agency, suggesting that despite decades of social change, fundamental fears about female independence remained deeply embedded in cultural consciousness. The commercialization of vibrators accelerated during the 1980s and 1990s, driven by changing social attitudes and technological innovations. Companies began marketing these devices directly to women through mainstream channels, using advertising that was frank about their sexual purpose while avoiding explicit imagery. The euphemistic language of the medical era gave way to honest discussions of pleasure and satisfaction, though marketing messages still often emphasized romantic relationships and conventional attractiveness. The adult industry's embrace of vibrators created new complications for feminist activists who had championed these devices as tools of liberation. When vibrators became associated with pornography and commercial sex, some feminists worried that their liberatory potential was being co-opted by industries that objectified women. Others argued that women's right to pleasure shouldn't be constrained by concerns about how that pleasure was marketed or represented. This tension reflected broader questions about the relationship between sexual liberation and commercial exploitation that continue to resonate today. Can devices or practices that emerge from feminist politics maintain their liberatory potential when they become consumer products? How do we distinguish between authentic sexual empowerment and commercialized versions of empowerment designed to sell products? The medical profession's response to the rediscovery of the hysteria episode was characteristically defensive. rather than using the episode as an opportunity to examine how cultural biases might continue to distort medical practice. Many practitioners dismissed it as an embarrassing historical anomaly with no contemporary relevance. This reaction suggested that the profession had learned less from its past errors than it might have, and that similar blind spots might still exist in current practice. Some progressive medical educators did attempt to incorporate the hysteria story into curricula as a case study in medical ethics and the sociology of medicine. These efforts emphasized the importance of examining one's own assumptions, listening to patients' experiences, and distinguishing between cultural beliefs and empirical evidence. But these lessons remained marginal within medical education, and many practitioners continued to approach women's health with attitudes that echoed earlier paternalistic approaches. The period also saw increased research into female sexuality that built on the foundations laid by Kinsey and Masters and Johnson. Scientists began studying the neurophysiology of sexual response, the psychology of desire, and the social factors that influence sexual satisfaction. This research gradually filled in the gaps in understanding that had enabled the hysteria episode, providing empirical foundations for approaching sexuality as a normal and healthy aspect of human experience. Drop a comment about whether you think we've fully learned the lessons of the hysteria episode, or if similar patterns of medical control and cultural denial might still exist today. The emergence of the internet in the 1990s revolutionized access to information about sexuality and sexual devices. Women could research vibrators, read reviews, and make purchases without having to navigate potentially embarrassing face-to-face interactions. Online communities developed where women could share experiences and advice about sexual satisfaction, creating informal networks that served some of the same functions as the consciousness-raising groups of the 1970s. This digital revolution democratized access to sexual knowledge in ways that would have been unimaginable during the hysteria era. Instead of depending on medical authorities to define their experiences, women could connect directly with each other, sharing information and validating experiences that might not fit into official categories. The internet created space for discussions of sexuality that were frank, diverse, and largely free from medical or moral gatekeeping. The technology industry's response to this demand was rapid and innovative. Companies developed increasingly sophisticated devices with features that would have amazed Victorian inventors. Modern vibrators incorporate wireless connectivity, customizable programs, and materials designed for safety and comfort. The evolution from Granville's hand crank contraptions to internet-connected devices represents one of the more surreal chapters in the history of technology. The cultural acceptance of vibrators reached a milestone in 1998 with the premiere of Sex and the City, a television show that featured frank discussions of female sexuality and regular references to vibrator use. The show's treatment of these devices as normal accessories of modern womanhood marked a complete reversal from the shame and secrecy that had characterized earlier eras. What had once been hidden medical procedures or underground contraband was now the subject of prime-time television comedy. This mainstream acceptance represented both progress and limitations. On one hand, it reflected genuine advances in social attitudes about female sexuality and women's right to pleasure. On the other hand, the commercialized and often superficial treatment of sexuality in popular culture sometimes reduced complex issues of desire, intimacy, and personal autonomy to consumer choices and lifestyle accessories. As we approach the final chapter of this remarkable historical journey, it's worth reflecting on what the hysteria episode reveals about the power of cultural assumptions to shape even scientific observation. The Victorian doctors who prescribed orgasms while denying their sexual nature weren't uniquely deluded. They were operating within intellectual frameworks that made certain observations impossible and certain interpretations inevitable. Their story serves as a reminder that medical knowledge is always culturally embedded, that professional authority can coexist with profound ignorance, and that the most obvious truths can remain invisible when they contradict dominant beliefs. The hysteria episode shows us how far society has traveled in acknowledging women's sexual agency, but it also suggests that the journey toward genuine understanding and equality remains incomplete. Why Victorian doctors gave women orgasms as a medical treatment. Part 8. Final. Today, as I write this in 2025, the vibrator sits comfortably on the shelves of mainstream retailers, advertised with the same casualness as coffee makers or exercise, equipment. The journey from Dr. Henderson's gaslit consulting room to the wellness section of your local pharmacy represents one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of human sexuality. But as we reach the end of this bizarre tale, the question remains, what have we actually learned from this spectacular episode of medical delusion? And are we truly beyond the cultural blind spots that made it possible? The hysteria episode serves as a masterclass in how entire societies can maintain elaborate systems of denial when reality conflicts with cherished beliefs. Victorian doctors weren't uniquely stupid or malicious. They were trapped within intellectual frameworks that made certain observations impossible and certain conclusions inevitable. They saw women experiencing obvious sexual pleasure, but couldn't acknowledge it because their entire worldview depended on female sexual passivity. They documented detailed physiological responses, but interpreted them through theories that bore no relationship to the evidence they were collecting. This capacity for collective self-deception didn't disappear with the Victorian era. The same patterns of seeing what we expect to see, rather than what's actually happening, continue to shape medical practice, social policy, and cultural attitudes. The hysteria story reminds us that being educated, well-intentioned, and scientifically trained doesn't automatically protect us from profound mistakes when our observations challenge fundamental assumptions about how the world works. Consider how long it took for the medical establishment to acknowledge what women had been telling them all along about their experiences. Victorian women knew their bodies better than their doctors did, but their knowledge was systematically dismissed or reinterpreted through medical theories that prioritized theoretical consistency over empirical evidence. This dynamic persists today in various forms. Patients whose experiences don't fit standard diagnostic categories, research that excludes or minimizes women's perspectives, and medical practices that prioritize institutional authority over individual expertise about one's own body. The rediscovery of the hysteria episode in the 1980s and 1990s coincided with broader movements toward evidence-based medicine and patient-centered care. These developments represented genuine progress in acknowledging the limitations of medical authority and the importance of listening to patients' experiences. But the fact that such obviously problematic practices could be so thoroughly erased from professional memory suggests that medicine's capacity for self-examination and course correction remains limited. Tell me in the comments, do you think there are aspects of current medical practice that future generations will look back on with the same bewilderment we feel about hysteria treatment? What modern assumptions about bodies, health, or sexuality might seem as absurd to our descendants as wandering wombs seem to us? The vibrator's evolution from medical device to consumer product to cultural icon reflects broader changes in how society understands the relationship between technology, pleasure, and human autonomy. The Victorian doctors who invented these devices to solve their occupational health problems accidentally created tools that would eventually challenge the very assumptions that had made their treatments necessary. The technology outlasted and ultimately undermined the theoretical framework that had justified its development. This pattern, where technological innovations reveal the inadequacy of existing social arrangements, has repeated throughout history. The birth control pill challenged assumptions about women's reproductive choices. The internet undermined traditional gatekeepers of information and community. Smartphones created new forms of intimacy and connection that existing social scripts couldn't accommodate. In each case, technology forced society to confront the gap between official ideologies and lived realities. The contemporary vibrator industry, now worth billions of dollars globally, represents both the triumph and the limitations of sexual liberation. On one hand, the widespread availability and social acceptance of these devices reflects genuine progress in acknowledging women's right to sexual pleasure and autonomy. On the other hand, the commercialization of sexuality has created new forms of pressure and expectation that can be as constraining as the old forms of repression. Modern marketing for vibrators often emphasizes performance, optimization, and technological sophistication in ways that echo broader cultural obsessions with productivity and self-improvement. The devices that were once symbols of liberation from social control have become products in an economy that profits from creating new forms of anxiety and inadequacy. The question of whether this represents progress or simply a more sophisticated form of control remains open to debate. The medical profession's current approach to female sexuality reflects both lessons learned and lessons ignored from the hysteria episode. Contemporary physicians are generally more aware of the importance of sexual health and more willing to discuss sexuality openly with patients. Sex therapy has become a legitimate medical specialty based on empirical research rather than cultural assumptions. Sexual dysfunction is increasingly understood as a complex phenomenon involving psychological, social, and physiological factors, rather than simple mechanical problems. However, many of the underlying dynamics that enabled the hysteria episode persist in subtler forms. Medical training still emphasizes pathology over normal variation, expert knowledge over patient experience, and individual treatment over social context. The profession remains largely male-dominated in positions of authority, and research continues to reflect gender biases in study design, participant selection, and interpretation of results. The persistence of these patterns suggests that the lessons of the hysteria episode haven't been fully integrated into medical education and practice. The story is often treated as a historical curiosity rather than a case study with contemporary relevance. This represents a missed opportunity to develop more sophisticated approaches to understanding how cultural biases shape scientific observation and medical practice. Drop a comment about whether you think the medical profession has genuinely learned from historical mistakes like the hysteria episode, or if similar patterns might still be operating in less obvious ways. The hysteria story also illuminates the complex relationship between individual liberation and social change. The women who received these treatments gained access to sexual satisfaction, but within a framework that denied their agency and pathologized their experiences. They discovered pleasure, but only by accepting medical authority over their bodies and desires. This tension between personal benefit and systemic oppression reflects broader challenges in movements for social change. Contemporary discussions of sexual empowerment often face similar tensions. Individual women's choices about sexuality, relationships, and pleasure occur within social contexts that continue to reflect inequalities of power and opportunity. The question of whether personal liberation can exist within unchanged social structures, or whether individual choices necessarily support or challenge existing arrangements, remains contentious and complex. The vibrator's journey from medical device to feminist icon to consumer product illustrates these complexities. Each stage of its evolution has involved both gains and losses, liberation and new forms of constraint. The device that once symbolized medical control over women's bodies has become a symbol of women's right to control their own pleasure, but it has also become a commodity in an economy that profits from sexualizing and objectifying women. As we conclude this extraordinary tale, it's worth reflecting on what the hysteria episode reveals about the nature of progress itself. The story isn't simply one of enlightenment triumphing over ignorance or liberation defeating oppression. It's a more complex narrative about how societies negotiate the tensions between existing beliefs and emerging realities, how technologies can both reinforce and challenge social arrangements, and how the same developments can simultaneously represent progress and create new problems. The Victorian doctors who prescribed orgasms while denying their sexual nature weren't evil villains in a morality tale. They were people trying to help their patients within the constraints of their time and place. Their spectacular failure to understand what they were doing serves as a reminder that good intentions and professional expertise don't automatically protect us from profound errors in judgment. The women who sought these treatments weren't passive victims or naive dupes. They were intelligent people navigating limited options and making the best choices available to them. Their experiences demonstrate both the resilience of human sexuality in the face of social repression and the costs of living in societies that refuse to acknowledge fundamental aspects of human nature. The hysteria episode ultimately reminds us that the relationship between knowledge and power, between individual experience and professional authority, between cultural beliefs and empirical evidence, remains dynamic and contested. The story doesn't end with the triumph of truth over falsehood, but with the ongoing negotiation of these tensions in new contexts and through new technologies. As you reflect on this bizarre journey through medical history, consider what it reveals about our current moment. What beliefs do we hold that might seem as absurd to future generations as wandering wombs seem to us? What technologies are we developing that might challenge assumptions we're not even aware we're making? What voices are we failing to hear because they contradict our comfortable certainties? The vibrator sits on pharmacy shelves today, not as a monument to progress achieved, but as a reminder of how far we've traveled and how far we still have to go. The journey from Victorian consulting rooms to contemporary bedrooms has been long, strange, and incomplete. The questions raised by this history about authority and autonomy, pleasure and power, technology and humanity remain as relevant today as they were when Dr. Granville first cranked up his revolutionary machine and accidentally changed the world. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable journey through one of history's most absurd and revealing episodes. The story of hysteria treatment reminds us that truth is often stranger than fiction, that progress is more complicated than we'd like to believe, and that understanding the past might just help us navigate the uncertainties of the present and future.